Thank you very much for the invitation to this conference. I appreciate it, and I'm very thankful for this experience. And also, does it work? Also, thank you for the kind introduction. First, I have to apologize my English. I will read in English, and maybe I have to switch into German in the discussion, but it will be translated. At least that's what Mark Jansen promised to me. In 1928, 4 young Mennonite men and 1 young Mennonite woman decided to exchange views on the matters that interested them by ways of circular letters. The group grew from one year to the next until by around 1940 it comprised more than 250 young men and women from all over the German Reich. Subgroups or circles of about 10 young men and women each communicated on various topics by entering a paragraph in a notebook and then sending the notebook to the next person in round-robin style. One member of the circle summed up the discussion for all in a booklet that was reproduced. Unique testimonies up to the time were thus created and have survived, at least in part, to the present. The circular community was special in that, for one thing, it was not a structural subdivision of a larger organization, but succeeded in bringing together young members from various German Mennonite associations, as much from Baden, Bavaria, and the Palatinate as from northern Germany, eastern and western Prussia, and even abroad, for example, from far as away as South America. What is more, these young adults pursued widely differing professional paths. They included theology students as well as farmers and metal workers. Young women played an active role. Whereas the literature on the subject already paints a clear picture of the Free Church's loyalty to the Nazi regime, the circulars now represent an excellent source of advancing our efforts to determine the reasons and motives for a positive attitude towards or involvement in the Nazi state. In terms of content, my analysis will concentrate on the conception of Volk and anti-Semitism in the period of the National Socialist assumption of power. That is because, in my opinion, we can thus arrive at a better understanding of why and how the Nazi brand of racism was upheld by members of the circular letter community. Yet, to a small extent, I will also take other aspects into account as well. For example, the Mennonite stance on the new church order and the topic of military conscription and violence. I will begin with these last mentioned points and proceed as follows. First, the conception of the church. Second, the stance of military conscription and violence. Third, the perspective on Volk and anti-Semitism. I will take a targeted look at written testimonies by Mennonites who, in the period of question, claimed to be the voice of the youth. Temporarily, it will focus on the phase marked by the Nazi seizure of power, during which, on a fundamental level, the course was set in the sphere of the free churches as elsewhere in the German society. I will, however, explicitly not argue that the patterns formed for the perception and interpretation of Volk and race remained in place, or that the protagonists in Nazi worldviews were in any way automatically upheld until the end of the regime. On the first point, at the start of the Nazi dictatorship, there was a basic agreement within the Mennonite community in Germany that the organizational divisions should join forces so as to be able to speak and act in concert vis-à-vis the state. It was a phase in which many of the Mennonite leaders should even imagine entering into an alliance, if only a loose one, with the Protestant Reich Church. Many consider this option preferable to becoming part of a third pillar in Germany, that is, in addition to the Protestant Reich churches and the Catholicism, a free church pillar. Because the Mennonites conceived of themselves as a reformed church and to an extent had issues with the evangelical missionary approach of the classical free church, such as the Baptists. In 1933-34, however, the inner Mennonite unification process made only very slow progress and ultimately failed altogether. One reason for this was the question pertaining to the theological profession of faith were bound up with the regulation of organizational matters. The young generation of Mennonites were dissatisfied about the fact that their seniors could not agree. What is more, the young Mennonites, or more precisely, the leading figures in the circular community around Theo Glück, made a specific contribution to that debate. Within the Mennonite community, the group around Glück promoted a conception of church and community linked with the idea of the congregational church. Theo Glück and his circle believed that Mennonites were called upon by God to make a specific testimonial, but at the time saw justification in the existence of the other churches in Germany. This point of view concurred with another key concept of the young circular generation, namely that of community. The latter came about as a result of the circular protagonist's generational circumstances. Here two generations were especially important. On the one hand, the group of those born around 1900 and already working in their professions in the early 1930s, and on the other hand, those born around 1910, many of whom were still undergoing vocational training. The latter were part of the war youth generation who had been teenagers in the post-World War I period and strongly influenced by that war without themselves having participated in it. Particularly among this group, born around 1910, the idea of being part of a specific community in German society was very well developed. Many of them, among them Theo Glück, had their roots in the youth movement known as the Bündische Jugend and brought this influence with them in the circular movement. Their conception of community found expression when, for example, the members of this generation referred to the term Volksgemeinschaft, people's community. At the time, I should add, this term was not yet being used exclusively in the National Socialist sense. Another manifestation was the special importance they attached to the category Volk, which, in keeping with Volkisch Protestant ethics, they conceived of as a divine order of creation. Already this rough outline gives a sense how deeply the Mennonite religious community was embedded in the contemporary context and influenced by its culture. The same applies to my second point, military service and violence. As is well known, in 1933, the Mennonite parent organization, die Vereinigung, spoke out demonstratively in favor of military service. There would be no claiming of special privileges when the draft was reinstated. This was a topic of lively discussion among young Mennonites, even if the number was included outspoken advocates of military service, and ultimately the German Mennonites did not come out as conscientious objectors. Yet the fact that members of a traditional peace church pledged themselves to an organization notorious for extreme acts of violence, the SA, requires an explanation. Particularly in the first month after the seizure of power, this subdivision of the Nazi party, NSDAP, was a driving force in the wrongdoings and crimes committed by the new regimes. Examples are the establishment of the so-called wild concentration camps, the extremely brutal persecution, even torture and murder of political opponents, and the role played by the SR in the campaign to boycott Jewish businesses in April 1st, 1933. Violence formed the core of Nazi politics and the SA. When Mennonites joined the SA, it had already evolved into a mass organization with far over 400,000 members, a number that would continue to grow until it reached between 4 and 5 million in 1934. Naturally, it will have been only a small proportion of active groups that were responsible for the SR's bloody rampages. Members who presumably had little or nothing to do with the Mennonite community Unfortunately, the sources provide too little information on this aspect to allow a reliable assessment. Yet the SR's violent terrorist orientation and image could not have gone unnoticed by the Mennonites. Nevertheless, the participants in the Mennonite Youth Circulars of 1933 made no mention of this aspect. This brings me to my third and last point: Volk, race, and anti-Semitism. As far back as June 1932, one of the group's important representatives, Hilde Funk, reported on the discussion in Circle 2 of the circular community. In a piece she titled, "Can a Christian be a National Socialist?" she leveled her criticism at a core element of the Nazi worldview and politics, racism. Significantly, however, she concentrated solely on the aspect of idolization, that is, on the overvaluation of the category race, without fundamentally condemning the latter. At the same time, she and the majority of the circular community expressed acceptance of an organological conception of Volk based on the categories of blood and race. Here, Volk was conceived of as a biological category and theologically legitimized as a divine order of creation. This stance was not a specific Mennonite doctrine, but an approach that had been elaborated on in detail above all within Protestant theology. At the time, however, it was also widespread within the Mennonite community as well as among the circular participants without any critical examination of its theological justifications ever having taken place. However, not all of the protagonists of the circular letters adhered to conservative Volkish Protestantism, such as that championed by the theology professor Paul Althaus of Erlangen. The position of Karl Barth was variably also discussed within the circular community, specifically by Cornelius Grahn, a student of Barth's. Eric Jansen impressively proved this in a thesis. Yet the fact that Grahn emigrated to the United States in the 1930s speaks for itself. Barth's theological orientation did not predominate within the circular community. On the other hand, the extent to which the virulent Volkish conception of society prevailed in that community is manifest in the reaction of its members to specific elements of National Socialist praxis, such as the anti-Jewish policies. Circle 12 made the race issue the subject of discussion at the end of 1933, beginning of 1934. Among other things, the writers cite the so-called Aryan paragraph, in which context they make a direct reference to events taking place in a number of Germany's regional churches at the time. The law for the restoration of professional civil service, das Gesetz zur Wiederherstellung des Berufsbeamtentums, which went into effect on April 7, 1933, represented the first fundamental anti-Jewish law in the Nazi state. It reintroduced the legal discrimination of Jews and paved the way for the elimination of Jews from all key public institutions, for example, the universities. In their assessment of the Nazi state's anti-Jewish policies, the circular letter writers made a significant distinction. For the realm of the church and congregation, they established in a clear and theologically well-founded manner, and evidently rather reluctantly in some cases, the Jews were to be treated without discriminations and put on an equal footing with all Christians. As far as the state was concerned, however, a folkish, racist approach and eugenic measures met with acceptance. The so-called Jewish question was once again the subject of discussion by the circular community in 1936-38. Anti-Semitic excesses and the Nazi state's juridical anti-Jewish measures had meanwhile intensified, a development that had culminated in the Nuremberg laws passed in 1935. From that time onward, Jews were degraded to the status of mere citizens of the state, in contradistinction to so-called Aryan citizens of the Reich who enjoyed full rights. What is more, by prohibiting relationships between Jews and the so-called Aryans, the Nazi laws severely invaded in private sphere. In this context, we find an important testimony to goodwill towards ostracized Jews. In July 1937, a female contributor to the circular discussion expressed her sympathy for the Jews whose discrimination she regarded as unjust. Here I quote the rather long passage. Signs saying Jews unwelcome are posted at the entrance to public establishments or at the door of post offices. This week I went to a municipal bathing facility and there it said, Jews not admitted. I must confess I can only shake my head at this and have unending sympathy for those it concerns. If one of them enters a shop, you're hardly allowed to talk to him, and if you do, then in such a way as to ensure that he doesn't return. How can these people help to the fact that they are born as Jews? If someone breaks a law, he should be punished, and there are a number of ordinances to enforce that. But that they should be despised for nothing, and that they are bored for every means of enjoying life with others, that is something I cannot condone. However, and this brings me to the problematic aspect of that writer's striking statement, even she, who had so courageously voiced her opinion within her circle of friends, elsewhere considered it opportune to justify the anti-Semitic measures practiced by the Nazi state. And again, I quote, "The fact that the Jews were the ones who damaged our folk and sucked it dry is something we can presumably agree on. And that they are no longer permitted to hold leading or high-level positions is also entirely correct, as opportunity makes a thief, and they would unerringly soon practice their clean craft again." Let me conclude. I have argued in my lecture that many members of the Mennonite youth circular community proved to be very open to folkish thought, even those who took a critical stance to National Socialism. The spread of the folkish mentality and the related conception of the folk as a divine order of creation, I hold, served firstly to bridge the gap to the Nazi concepts of folk and people's community. Secondly, it was a way to legitimizing active political involvement. And thirdly, it helped obscure the perception of illegal measures aimed at ostracizing both Jewish and political opponents to Nazism, measures already in effect in the face of the seizure of power. Anti-Semitic outlooks were not only fed by set pieces of traditional Christian anti-Judaism, but also bore relation to the racist understanding of folk. There was, on the one hand, a powerful stance based on religious convictions that forbade anti-Semitic and racist attitudes towards Jews, at least within the realm of the congregation and the church. On the other hand, however, the members of the circular community voiced no fundamental criticism of the National Socialist policies towards Jews of the years 1933 to approximately 1936. The reason for this, I argue, is that those policies were essentially perceived as warranted.